The following is a project of our nonprofit newsroom. Support Midcoast Morning and local journalism today at chly.ca/donate. Local news doesn't survive without local support.
Hello and welcome to Midcoast Morning. I'm Joe Pugh. Nanaimo City Council is calling on BC Housing to contemplate sober housing for those who qualify for supportive housing and are in recovery. Council also wants to see a sober housing model used for a planned site at 250 Terminal Avenue. Today on the program, we'll hear from the new Minister of Housing and Municipal Affairs, and we'll also hear from someone in recovery who's a program manager at a Nanaimo supportive housing site. First up, though, here's Council's discussion on the matter from July 28th. You'll hear Councillor Erin Hemmons introducing the motion.
I'd like to move that the Mayor write a letter to the new Minister of Housing and Municipal Affairs to reiterate Council's strong desire to see BC Housing contemplate sober housing for those who qualify for supportive housing and who are in recovery, and that BC Housing consider the sober housing model for the upcoming project at 250 Terminal.
Seconded, Councillor Perino. I think you beat Councillor Armstrong to this motion, Councillor Hemmons. This one has some enthusiastic support.
Thank you. I will note, Councillor Armstrong and I have been on this for years, and BC Housing will not be news to them that we're asking for this. And I did, again, I'm being driven by the voices of the neighbourhood. Newcastle specifically asked for this, so I think we can meet them there. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Armstrong, did you say something?
Support for the simple fact that in my job with my board position on the Alano Club, we hear from many people in recovery that have no place to live and that they'd like to stay sober and clean, but sometimes they can't because they get put in situations where they're not given that opportunity. And I also think it would be cheaper in the long run, so you can move people that don't need 24/7 supports into there and then free up the beds for those that do. I think it needs to be progressive. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Councillor Manley, please.
Thank you. Yeah, I would say I'm strongly in support of this as well, having run a shelter and seeing people coming out of recovery and treatment and going back into the shelter and being exposed to substance abuse around them. And I think that the people that are seeking a clean and sober lifestyle should be provided with supportive housing to do that. And I also think that the Newcastle neighborhood has done their turn in this community. They've dealt with a lot over the last almost decade now, and so I'm very supportive of seeing this particular project be a sober housing project. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm not going to gild the lily. I'll just simply say I agree with everything that's been said. All those in favor and any opposed? None. Motion carries.
Francesca Plewes is a program manager for a supportive housing facility here in Nanaimo. She's also a person in recovery. I asked her what kinds of things a person exiting addiction treatment would be looking for when trying to find housing.
Well, it's important because if you go back to your old housing where you were using, especially for the folks who would be in supportive housing, the use is so amplified. Like I hear people say, I've experienced this myself with clients that I've served where teams will say, oh, well, there's drug use everywhere, and all over the city. And that's true. But on the scale that it happens in supportive housing, that is not common at all, because it's in the hallways, it's in the rooms, everyone knows each other. So to have a safe space to go to after is, I would argue, one of the most important parts, because you're not surrounded by those old triggers, you're not surrounded by those old people that you used to use with, but it is incredibly difficult to find the appropriate housing or even accommodations, even if it's short term, when you are exiting treatment, because there's just simply not enough.
So if you're exiting treatment, let's say you're maybe not the demographic that qualifies for supportive housing, like just you're looking for a place to rent on the private market or whatever. In that situation, what are the things you're considering if you're looking for housing coming out of addiction treatment? Well, ideally, you would like to be living with other like-minded people. And the reason for that is because, for me, at least as like an addict in recovery, my brain can tell me all types of wacky things. Like it's okay to just isolate and, scroll on your phone all the time. Like that's, one of the
maybe least harmful versions of it, but especially in early recovery, when we're left alone with our thoughts, that's when bad things start to happen. Boredom, people talk about that being a huge trigger. So when you're looking for housing, when you're exiting treatment, aside from it being around like-minded people, ideally it would be affordable. Ideally it would be close to bus routes, because a lot of people don't have their license when they're first kind of entering recovery. And there would be supports in place for you to continue kind of on the straight and narrow there, right? Because when you're in residential treatment, everything is highly regimented. From when you wake up to when you go to bed, you're doing a million things. You're doing, therapy as well. And ideally, when you exit treatment, you would kind of be doing the same things. Like maybe you would be going to a therapist. Maybe you would be having meals planned for you, right? Because it might sound silly, but a lot of those skills, for me at least, I didn't have. I didn't know how to cook for myself. I only knew how to skip the dishes. So I needed it to be modeled and shown to me. So to be around other people maybe who have been through it, maybe staff members or something like that, to show me how to do that and to keep me accountable.
Can you give me a sense of the cost of maybe addiction treatment, first of all, and then what you might call second stage sober housing? Yeah, so treatment on the island varies anywhere between $30,000 to $40,000 for about a 30 to 35 day stay. And when I'm talking about treatment, I don't mean like a detox facility where you're there for a maximum of 7 days. Those are usually free. Those are usually covered by the government. However, there's very long wait lists to get in, and you're calling every day to see if they have a bed, right? So a lot of people choose residential treatment because they do provide detox. So you don't have to call multiple times a day. You can be slotted in fairly quickly there. So yeah, the treatment is about, I would say average is about $32,000 for 30 days. You can choose to extend your stay. Sometimes they'll choose that for you. Some people have that covered by Veterans Affairs, by their Indigenous bands. But the vast majority of people are what are called private funders. So, maybe their parents, their siblings, their spouse, people take second mortgages out on their houses to pay for loved ones' treatment. So that's the initial treatment. And then when you exit, second stage, at least in kind of Central Island, varies somewhere between maybe $1,800 at the lowest end to a maximum of $2,500. And some include food, some do not. Some include shared living spaces, some do not. But you're looking to spend a fair amount in order to enter recovery, at least through that way. And to your knowledge, there is nothing like that really exists in the supportive housing infrastructure in Nanaimo right now?
No, nothing long term. There's like landing pads available to people. And when I say landing pads, I mean if someone is exiting Clearview, for example, like the detox center in town, and there's maybe a little bit of maybe it's a 2-week gap until they can enter treatment. There is 2 spaces that I can think of in the city where it's very short term. One is up to a month. The other one is about 3 weeks-ish. But both of them, I wouldn't call them entirely abstinence-based, which is good. Like there needs to be some flexibility there, but I wouldn't call it like an entirely drug-free housing. And again, there's wait lists for those as well. So in terms of actual housing, that kind of fits under that supportive housing model. No, there's none.
You talked about the idea of, I wouldn't call it entirely a drug-free, but that's good. Like there needs to be a sort of continuum. How does the idea of substance use in some of the sober, second stage sober housing that does exist, how do the tensions get managed that might come up if, say, someone has an incident of relapse or something like that?
Well, I think it would depend on the program. In my experience, for the sober houses here, it's very individualized. Like, I've seen some people be kicked out after a relapse. And I've seen other people where they can stay, but there's maybe stricter rules around things. I think under a supportive housing model, it would be very interesting to see how that would go, because as it stands right now, supportive housing has to be under the RTA, the Residential Tenancy Agreement. And it used to be under something called a program agreement. So they changed this last year, and last February, BC Housing did. And though a lot would argue that's really great that it's under RTA, there's actually not a lot of flexibility for program providers, for housing providers in terms of discipline, for lack of a better word. So I think if it was a supportive housing, sober living model, I struggle to picture what that would look like aside from eviction, because there's not much really they can do. So I would be curious, and I would hope that they would collaborate with people with lived experience, with other program housing providers, maybe even talking to people in Vancouver who have done a similar model as this to kind of brainstorm, because as it stands right now, if it was considered long-term housing, the only real thing that they could use would be eviction. And that's not good enough for something that we know is a relapsing disease, right? And there's lots of gray involved. What might be considered a relapse for one person is actually completely fine behavior for the next. And what I mean by that is, like, I've seen people who have issues maybe with sex addiction alongside their substance use. So if they're talking to I don't know, a boy or whatever gender they're attracted to, that could be considered a relapse. But then for the next person, it's not. So I really think it would have to be a highly individualized, carefully thought out process, and very well written in their tenancy agreement.
So today, you've talked about already how a supportive housing environment as it exists today could be very difficult for someone exiting homelessness who might have also exited like a detox facility and might be trying to continue not using substances. But you also highlighted there some of the tension points where it would be difficult to have some kind of non-draconian consequence for someone who had a relapse. Is there a way you think that tension could be managed?
I think it could be. I think in terms of relapse, let's just say that for lack of a better example, I think it could be managed if they met with the person and individualized a care plan, right? Maybe it's 3 strikes, you're out. Maybe it's, if you get honest with us first, there won't be the same repercussions. I think it can be managed, but I also think the reality is that when you're housing the population who would normally be eligible for supportive housing, we're going to see certain behaviors that maybe you wouldn't normally see in, let's say, an average privately funded sober living. And we should expect that. So I think that there should be policies, procedures, and maybe whether they're using tenancy agreements or not, there should be something in place that allows the understanding that these things will probably happen. But how can we mitigate homelessness, for lack of a better word, for evicting them into homelessness and then possibly even death if they relapsed and overdose? So I think it would have to be highly individualized and very trauma informed to ensure that there's best successful outcomes, really.
At their most recent meeting last week, Nanaimo City Council unanimously passed a motion. I'll just read that motion now to make sure I've got it right. That mayor and council, that the mayor write a letter to the new Minister of Housing and Municipal Affairs to reiterate council's strong desire to see that BC Housing contemplates sober housing for those who qualify for supportive housing and who are in recovery, and that BC Housing consider the sober housing model for the upcoming project at 250 Terminal. Maybe putting aside the last sentence of that, what do you make of that motion, the part specifically that BC Housing contemplates sober housing for those who qualify for supportive housing and who are in recovery?
I mean, I do believe it's really needed. I think it's interesting that they use the word contemplate, because I would argue, in my opinion at least, there's no contemplation needed. This is something that is 100% needed. In my mind, and this is coming from someone who manages the supportive housing, there can't just be one without the other.
Fair to say you think the idea of having some kind of sober supportive housing model is something that we're not doing right now, at least in Nanaimo, and that you think is a no-brainer, but it would need to be something that is still like sort of a continuum?
Mm-hmm. Exactly. I think it needs to be a continuum of care because in theory, as it stands right now, at least according to BC Housing, when you look at the circle, it's a circle of housing is how they kind of describe it. So there's shelter, then there's transitional housing, then there's supportive housing, then there's subsidized. And in theory, what they'd like to see is people move on to what's called market rent. So what maybe you or I would be renting under like a private landlord or a housing company. So that's kind of their idea, right? Is people move through it. But what's lost on there and what's kind of been not acknowledged until now is that the folks who are accessing and eligible for supportive housing, not all of them, but a large amount do struggle with addiction. They do struggle with mental illness. So where are they supposed to go if and when they choose to enter recovery? Because there's nothing. There's just a gap. The idea that they return back to their supportive housing, I think, is honestly, I just think it's silly and maybe even naive to believe that someone could successfully remain sober there. I'm not saying I have seen it happen before, but I've been in this field since 2013 and I've only seen it maybe 5 times because it's hard. It's really hard. So I do believe it's desperately needed, especially in Nanaimo where it's such a treatment town, right? Like we're between 2 huge, actually 3 now, giant treatment centers. You know, there's lots of sober livings. There's the detox here. Like it is needed. And I hope to see it move forward.
Is there anything else you think it's important to bring to the conversation on this issue today?
I would hope that if BC Housing agrees to this, I would hope that there would be collaboration. That's really the only thing that I would like to hammer home. I hope that there would be collaboration with the treatment centers. I hope that there would be collaboration with fellow program managers to kind of help ensure the most success with this. Because if this works, this could be great. Like I hear, I have a couple of friends who work in treatment and they, over the last couple of years, there's been a certain type of funding available in treatment, private treatment, and it's called CMHA beds or VHA beds, for lack of a better word, kind of colloquially. And what that means is people who would normally not be able to afford this type of treatment are funded through Island Health or they're funded through CMHA, which is wonderful. But the stories I've heard constantly are their aftercare plan is for them to live in the car. Their aftercare plan of treatment is to go to a shelter. And it's heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking for everyone. So I just would really hope that if this moves forward, there would be a lot of collaboration from all parties and that it could be created in a evidence-based and in a trauma-informed way so that people can enter recovery in a healthy and safe way.
Francesca Plewes is in recovery and manages a supportive housing program in Nanaimo. I was asking her about Nanaimo City Council's recent motion reiterating their strong desire to see BC Housing develop a sober housing model for people eligible for supportive housing who are in recovery. Coming up, we'll hear from BC's new Minister of Housing and Municipal Affairs.
Midcoast Morning is part of our nonprofit newsroom project, supported by listeners like you. Keep this program on the air by funding it today with a monthly sustaining donation at chly.ca/donate. We've got tote bags and shirts if you need an incentive.
Nanaimo City Council recently unanimously reiterated a strong desire to see BC Housing implement a sober housing model for people eligible for supportive housing who are in recovery. Council also called for that model to be used at a planned housing site at 250 Terminal Avenue. I spoke with BC's new Minister of Housing and Municipal Affairs, Christine Boyle, about the letter Council voted to send to her. Minister Boyle, what's your response to Nanaimo City Council's unanimous decision to share their strong desire with you to see BC Housing contemplate sober housing for those who qualify for supportive housing?
I really appreciate the partnerships that we as a provincial government have with local governments in delivering housing all across the housing spectrum to meet the needs of British Columbians. We know that includes everything from affordable home ownership opportunities and affordable rentals to supportive housing for people who are on the street or struggling to stay housed. And we've had great partnerships with local governments across the province in being able to deliver that badly needed housing. And the conversations that we have, including this one, are an important way that we move that housing forward. So this year alone, we've opened 109 units of temporary housing with supports in Nanaimo. We have more homes on their way in Nanaimo for people all across that spectrum. And that conversation and that openness with the local government is important.
Specifically on the sober housing piece, though.
I was just going to go there. Just to say, we are working right now on a housing project called Sparrow on Nelson Street, expected to be open later this year or early next year, that is specifically focused on residents who are committed to their recovery journey and looking for housing that meets that need. It doesn't mean that people would lose their housing if they fell off, or if that recovery journey meant they were using and trying to get back on track again. It's important that we provide that stability and support to people. We know that a recovery journey is not linear, and people need the space and supports to be able to stay on it. And so that's the focus of this housing that, again, I'm excited about seeing open later this year or early next year, that will meet that need, along with other housing that we are working with Nanaimo Council and others on building, that meets people where they're at and helps them come inside and access the services that they need.
Now, in May, BC Housing made a presentation to members of Nanaimo City Council. They reported on 13 current or planned supportive housing sites in Nanaimo. Of those sites, the one you just mentioned, Sparrow, that was the only one that it was suggested had a tenanting plan for individuals on a path of wellness and stabilization. Do you feel like that's the right ratio? Is there enough just with that one site?
You know, the work we do on housing to meet the needs of particularly folks who are struggling is really based on the work we're able to do in the community to know who needs that housing and what their specific needs are. So we know there's a need for all kinds of focused housing, and this is one example, housing that is intended to specifically support people in their recovery journey. All of this housing is badly needed. And again, I really appreciate the leadership from places like the Nanaimo Council in understanding that people in this housing are safer when they're able to come indoors. Communities are safer when people who are unhoused are able to come indoors. All of this housing is an important piece of supporting people who are struggling and supporting communities and making all of our communities safer. So I'm glad to see all of those projects happening. I know this one project meets the needs that the council has identified in this letter, and all of it is important work.
Now, the second piece of that letter from Nanaimo City Council was about a specific site, a planned site at 250 Terminal. The letter called on BC Housing to implement a sober housing model in that specific building. Is that a decision you would consider weighing in on or having some influence?
The site that we're looking at 250 is using what is a widely recognized and proven housing first model, meaning that housing is provided first and then supports are moved into place. The Sparrow site, over on Nelson Street will include spaces for people who are in shelters or other housing who then are looking for a recovery-focused space. So often people will move into one housing site, and if they're stabilizing and their needs are shifting, they can move into a site that better meets those needs. That's part of what makes such a difference in terms of having a spectrum of housing with options for people. So the site on Terminal Avenue, like I said, is a housing first model, and having the Sparrow site could also help meet the need that council's identified and the need that we know exists for some people who are looking for that housing, but isn't where everyone is at.
Now, last week, Nanaimo reported on its provincially mandated housing targets. It was shared that we exceeded the total number of housing units required by the province by more than 100. But at the same time, other than the hearth units you've talked about, there wasn't a single unit of affordable housing added in Nanaimo in the last year. What is the government doing to make sure that it is creating a spectrum of housing, as you say, and not just supportive housing with no barriers and then market housing that is out of reach for many people?
Yeah, we know that there's a need across that spectrum, and as a government, we've made historic investments in non-market and below-market housing, as well as the important work with local governments to build more housing options all across that spectrum. I will have to dive into the specific numbers in Nanaimo, but I really, like I've said, I really appreciate the leadership that Nanaimo has been providing on many of these fronts. And I come from a local government background myself. I have just been in this ministry file for the last 2 weeks, but I spent many years in local government wrestling as they are doing with the importance of these challenges. And so I'm looking forward to getting to further those conversations and work as partners in figuring that out. The housing challenges that residents face across BC continue to be a huge priority for our government, and the actions that we've been taking are making a difference. We're seeing rents come down in many areas across the province. We're seeing that the price of housing isn't going up as much as it used to. Of course, there's more that we need to do in Nanaimo in many places, and that's partnership work that I'm looking forward to doing with Mayor and Council.
Minister Boyle, thank you so much for taking the time.
Of course. Thanks for covering this.
Christine Boyle is British Columbia's Minister of Housing and Municipal Affairs. That's our show for the day. Thank you for joining me. I'm Joe Pugh, host and producer of Midcoast Morning. Jesse Woodward is our executive producer, and Arby Frew is our technical advisor. Our theme song is First One by local Nanaimo band Waste Management. If you have a story you'd like us to cover, email us at news@chly.ca. That's all for now. I'll talk to you on another Midcoast Morning.
Midcoast Morning would not be possible without the funding of the Community Radio Fund of Canada's Radio Meters program and generous listeners like you. This program gives thanks to the Nanaimo First Nation as we broadcast and podcast from their traditional territory. Thanks for listening.